A dozen years after the father of athletics, William B. Curtis, went missing and was found dead on Mount Washington in New Hampshire, the Boston Globe reported on a new victim of the mountain. On September 21, 1912, victims on Mount Washington, 5 men and 1 woman, have lost their lives on its rugged slopes in the past. The article mentions Curtis and Ormsby and previous victims of the mountain before telling us about a possible new victim, John M. Keenan. John M. Keenan of Charlestown will make the 7th person to lose his life on Mount Washington if he is not found alive. There has not been a fatality on the mountain since 12 years ago, when 2 New York men perished in a belated snowstorm on June 30, those being Curtis and Ormsby. John M. Keenan lived in Charlestown, Massachusetts, near Boston, and was working for the Boston and Maine Railroad, where he disappeared as a member of a party from the railroad's engineering department, surveying the route for the proposed electric scenic railway up the mountain. He is reported to be a civil engineer for the first week of his disappearance, and not until September 26 does the North Adams transcript set it straight that Keenan was not an engineer, as has been erroneously stated. He was not over 19 years of age and was unaccustomed to the woods. On September 20, the Portsmouth Herald was reporting that John had been missing for 36 hours and that he was a new man employee. He had been at work only a few days and was not at all familiar with the mountains. Wednesday morning, about 11 a.m., he was with a party of surveyors on the cone of the mountain near the Lake of the Clouds and beyond the head of Ammonoosuc Avenue. He was holding a line rod and was standing at some considerable distance from the others of the party. The transcript telegram tells us it was a half-mile distance and was in plain sight, while the North Adams transcript explains that Keenan was left by the professional transit man, a co-worker, on a point to establish a back site. He was told to remain there until they returned for him. The Boston Globe article continues. They were at cloud level, and suddenly a thick cloud rolled in and enveloped them so that the others could not see Keenan. Thinking that he might be frightened, they told him to remain where he was until the others came up. But when they reached the spot, he was not to be found. Hoping to attract his attention, the other surveyors shouted and fired revolver shots, but without result. It is supposed that in his fright, when the cloud enveloped him and cut off the others from his sight, Keenan disregarded directions and tried to find his companions, but started in the wrong direction and was lost. The wind was howling a gale over 50 miles an hour, and the temperature was only 40 degrees, and Keenan, who was 23 years of age, may have perished of exhaustion. It is possible, too, that in the cloud mist he fell and was stunned or too badly injured to move. Up to tonight, although every effort has been made to find him, it has been fruitless. As soon as he was missed, messages were sent to the various parts of the mountains, and everyone was put on the watch, but no one has reported seeing him. At last night, the bell on the summit was kept ringing, and the steam whistle at the base was blown at frequent intervals in hope of attracting his attention, and at 5 o'clock this morning, a party of 20 set out after him. All day they searched the mountain, but without result. The Barry Daily Times reported that the clouds are still heavy, and the searchers are carrying blankets and provisions, lest they lose their way. Not reported until the 23rd, but on the 20th, one of the searchers, Fire Warden Briggs, claimed to have seen Keenan on the Raymond path. This would have been shortly after he was missing. Apparently this was a false lead. On the 21st, the Globe reports on a Mr. Haynes, one of the searchers, who thinks Keenan may have wandered into Oaks Gulf, which is very dangerous as there are no trails. The next day, the Boston Globe's front page announced searchers find no trace of Keenan, but offered some hope in the subheadline, Late Night Report of Stranger Seen on Pinkham Notch Road Gives Only Hope for His Safety. This hope was because at 10:20 tonight, George Turner of Bethlehem and Dr. Guile of Hanover passed a man late this afternoon on the Pinkham Notch Road, leading from Glen to Jackson, who may prove to be a missing boy. Mr. Turner and Dr. Guile say they passed a travel-worn man who appeared almost demented, his face having a vacant expression, and that when they rode by him, he turned and pointed to the mountain. As the Boot Spur Trail leads from the Crawford Path through Tuckerman's and thence out to the Pinkham Notch Road, the junction of the Boot Spur Trail and Crawford Trail being not more than a mile from the place Keenan was last seen, it may prove that he found his way to the road. The transcript telegram explains that the two men did not know of Keenan's disappearance, and they thought the man lived nearby. The Evening Star reports that mountaineers express the opinion that Keenan's only hope lies in the lifting of the fog, which makes search above the cloud level too dangerous to be attempted. This sighting by Turner and Guile caused the Boston Globe to run the headline, Searching on Glen Road, Parties Looking for Man Seen Yesterday. Probably Keenan is crazed by his awful experiences, may have taken refuge in lumber camp near Glen Ellis Fall, and tells of the search broadening to include the early train from Fabien's to Bartlett, where they took the road toward Glen. It is hoped that young Keenan, if it was he, will stay near the road, and that the heavy rain last night caused him to seek shelter in one of the lumber camps near the Glen Ellis Falls. Doubtless if he is still alive, as it seems he must be if he were the man seen yesterday, he is crazed by fear and exposure. Otherwise, he would have made his true plight known to the men who passed him by. Upon the heading, Father Sees Little Hope, the Globe reports that no trace has been found of the leveling rod John carried, the lead plummet, or his coat. Then the Globe wonders whether he crossed the Pinkham Notch Road and wandered into the Carter Range, which runs behind the Glen House to Gorham, is a question, and the mystery of his whereabouts seems deeper now than at any time. Under the headline, Father Loses Heart, the Globe quotes Mr. Keenan as saying, "The boy's mother told me when I started Saturday morning to bring John back, dead or alive, but after spending one night in the surveyor's camp and then going to the summit, I could stand it no longer. While there was little snow on the mountain, but there was a great deal of ice and the weather was cold. Yesterday was the clearest day since my son was lost, and at first I left confident the boy would be found before night. There are hundreds of men searching the mountain, and I am satisfied that everything possible is being done. But after spending one night in the camp, I cannot believe that the boy could survive all this time in the open." The Boston Globe's front page article of the 21st tells us a little about John, including helping us peg his age, as the many articles collected vary in reporting his age from 14 up to 23. "I wish I could go up and search for my boy," exclaimed Mrs. Lawrence J. Keenan, the grief-stricken mother of James M. Keenan, the 18-year-old Charleston boy who left his home at 54 Bartlett Street, Charleston, a week ago, Monday, to work on surveys on Mount Washington, and who was lost in the clouds on the mountain Wednesday morning. Mr. and Mrs. Keenan and their 5 children in Charleston are deep in grief over the disappearance of John, but are hoping he will be found alive. Mrs. Keenan said that her son John had worked on an elevator in Boston, but gave up that place to go to work for the Boston and Maine Railroad on the mountain survey. The mother received a letter yesterday morning from her missing son, which was dated Monday, September 16, in which he said he was well and asked that she send him a heavy sweater and a pair of heavy shoes as he needed them, the weather being cold on the mountain and the mountain climbing being hard on shoes. This letter, by the way, is never explained in the press until 1916, 4 years later, that John has sent the letter on September 16, 2 days before he went missing on the 18th. Young Keenan was graduated from the Warren Grammar School with the class of 1908. He is in his 19th year and is very large, weighed about 165 pounds. He is the eldest of the 6 Keenan children. Keenan's father, encouraged by last night's report of the stranger seen on Pinkham Notch Road, will go to the mountain today. The next day, the Baltimore Sun added that Mrs. Keenan said today that she either dreamed or felt that she heard her son calling her last night. She even arose from bed and went to the window to see if anyone were outside. On the 23rd, the Boston Globe reported that man in lumber camp near Gorham was found to be a tramp. Another false lead. 5 days after John went missing, the Bennington Evening Banner reported that it is thought that Keenan may have reached an Appalachian shelter in the vicinity where he could find food and protection from the weather. The boy's father returned home today, discouraged at the prospects. Tomorrow a search will be made of various shelters on the mountain. 6 days after John went missing on September 24, the Kennebec Journal was reporting about fear that he fell over a precipice and that the mystery of his disappearance may lie, it is believed, tonight in his having stepped over the brink of Tuckerman's Ravine. No great search has been made there, but tomorrow morning the hunt will be taken up in that section. Still, hope is waning. The article continues. Hope of his safety, which had been held by many of the searchers, is practically abandoned tonight. It was announced that the young man's fellow engineers have been recalled to work tomorrow morning and must give up the search, and that the railroad men who have been assisting in the hunt also must go back to the regular duties tomorrow. A half-dozen skilled woodsmen will continue the hunt, but it is the general fear that the young man will not be found alive. Nevertheless, this article ends. Keenan will be found alive, in the opinion of many of the party. The extreme cold of the past few days has been followed by more seasonable weather, and the dense fog has disappeared. Wild berries, upon which a person could live, abound on the slopes of the mountain. This article states that John vanished on the open kedgers near the summit. Looking up the word kedger, all we can find is the obsolete word meaning a small anchor or grapnel, and its most recent usage, cited, was from 1728. A strange notice appears in the Boston Globe on September 24. It just seems too early for a notice so blasé. Neponset Council closed its meeting last night in Odd Fellows Hall at an early hour and held a social. Readings were given by Charles E. Perry, and John A. Swanstrom told of his trip to the White Mountains and of the search for John M. Keenan of Charleston, who was lost on Mount Washington last Thursday morning. Refreshments were served and there was carpet bowling. On September 25, the Barry Daily Times reports that the bottom of Milliken's Pond on the slopes of Mount Washington was dragged without results, in the belief on the part of several of the searchers that the young man had been drowned there. Tuckerman's Ravine was scanned closely, but also to no avail. On the 26th, the Boston Globe reports that the mother of the young man was on the summit today and went to the spot where her son was last seen. Mrs. Keenan has practically given up hope that her son will be found alive, but said that in case he got down the mountain and found his way to a railroad, he would not have returned home, but would have continued on his way to New York, where Mrs. Keenan has a sister. Young Keenan is known to have had about $10 with him at the time of his disappearance a week ago today. Mrs. Keenan, besides visiting the spot where her son disappeared, went to various other parts of the mountain near the summit, and when she left on the special train in the afternoon, she seemed convinced that either her son was wandering aimlessly about the country or that his body was in one of the ravines. The Boston Evening Transcript adds, "The searchers will next look through the ridge and lanes on the east side of the mountain." After this, young Keenan's story drops away until November 29, when Mr. and Mrs. Keenan received a letter from Dr. George Villeneuve in Montreal. He was the superintendent of the St. John de Dieu Hospital and has written saying that a boy answering Keenan's description has been in the hospital since September 18, as reported in the Buffalo News. September 18 was the day John Keenan disappeared. Also on November 29, the Morning Call announced, "Spiritualist provides clue. Parents seek lost son in a Canadian hospital." They claim Keenan's parents have left for Montreal to visit the hospital for the insane. And this article adds, a spiritualist told Mrs. Keenan a few days after the boy was lost that her son was in a big hospital beside a big river in Canada. Last night, Mrs. Keenan received a letter from authorities in Montreal saying a lad answering her son's description is there. Contradicting the information about their departure from Montreal, the Boston Globe on November 30 reports directly from the family. Lawrence J. Keenan, the boy's father, told a Globe representative last evening that he believes his son is in some hospital to the northward. He said that he and his wife wrote Sunday to the hospitals in a number of Canadian cities, and that on Wednesday afternoon he received a letter from St. John de Dieu that a young man in some respects answering the description of his son had been received there September 18 and is still there, his identity unknown. On the strength of that news, Mr. Keenan was about to start for Montreal, but concluded to forward a photograph of his son for identification, and then, if the response made it advisable, to go there to see the patient. Up to last evening, Mr. Keenan had heard nothing direct from the Montreal hospital. This article also states that John Keenan is 16 years old, and having been in direct contact with the father, it seems it would be the most accurate. Unfortunately, the Brantford Weekly Expositor reported on December 5, Dr. George Villeneuve denied this morning that John M. Keenan was an inmate of his institution. This article also states that the doctor had no one in the hospital answering young Keenan's description, and he had notified Mrs. Keenan to that effect. And for 4 years, Keenan disappears from the press, until the Boston Globe recalls his story in 1916, ending, "Not even the lad's line rod was ever discovered. The cloud mists had hidden him for all time."